Hi everyone! So today, I will be discussing to you what is the accounting equations. So ano nga ba itong tinatawag natin na accounting equations? So the learning objective of this topic is to illustrate the accounting equations, define and explain what is asset, liabilities, and capitals are, and solve simple cases with the use of accounting equation. So what is the accounting equations? Okay, so the accounting equation is asset is equals to liabilities plus equity or capital. Gaya ng nakikita natin sa screen, A is equals L plus E. And this equation is what we use or applies in the accounting process. So bakit nga ba? But before we further discuss this accounting equation, let us first tackle the elements of these equations. What is an asset? Ano nga ba ang asset? What is liabilities? And what is an equity or capital? It is important that we should know first the definition of this term so that we would understand the accounting equations. Note also that these terms are element of a specific financial statement that we called balance sheet or statement of financial positions. So let's start with the asset. Ano nga ba ang asset? Gaya ng sabi ko, asset is one of the elements of financial statements. Its definitions, based on the March 2018 conceptual framework for financial reporting, is it is a present economic resources controlled by the entity as a result of past events and from which future economic events are expected to flow to the entity. So, anong ibig sabihin yan? Let's put it in a simple way. Assets are actually a resources of the company that they use in the operations of the business. So I'll give you an example. Cash is one of the common example of an asset. Next is inventories, machinery, office supplies, land, and buildings. There are actually a lot of assets. Hindi lamang itong nabanggit ko. Pero para may idea kayo kung ano ang asset, then I give you this as an examples. If we put it in a layman's terms, masasabi natin na halos lahat ng nakikita natin sa isang entity na kagamitan na they own, may value, at ginagamit nila sa operation is actually an asset. But tanong, is people or employees can be considered as an asset? Well, the answer is no. Though naririnig natin na tinatawag na asset ang mga good and skilled employees or human resources, lalo na yung mga sinasabing mahalaga sa isang company. However, in accounting parlance, we don't record or consider them as an asset. That is because we cannot measure their value. And take note, these employees are only hired by the company for their service, but they are not owned by the company or the business itself. So go back with the definition of asset. Sabi, it is a present economic resources controlled by the entity as a result of past events and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the entity. So remember that there are important elements that we should check first before we consider an item or resources as an asset. First is control. Second is the past events. And third is the future economic benefits. So based on the definition, ang sabi, asset is an economic resources controlled by the entity. So for an item or resources, one requirement for it to be considered as an asset is that these items or resources should be controlled and owned by the entity. The entity must have the right and control over these items. So, kailan ba natin masasabing may control si entity? Siyempre, if they own the item or thing or the resources, they have the present ability to prevent other parties from directing the use of that resources and from obtaining whatever is the economic benefits that may flow from that resources. So, dapat the entity have full rights and control over that resources. So the second element or requirement is that the resources should be a result of past events. So bakit? Ano ba yung past events na nangyari? Ano yung mga transactions or events na nangyari? Bakit ka nagkaroon ng control and rights over the resources? So for example, nag-invest ka ng capital for the business. So nagkaroon ngayon ng cash yung business mo. Bumili ka ng office supplies for the business. So nagkaroon ka ng office supplies. Bumili ka ng lupa at nagpatayo ka ng building as pwesto ng business mo. So, nagkaroon ka ngayon ng land and building. So, merong past events na nangyari. Kaya ka nagkaroon ng mga resources or asset. And that assets are expected to bring future economic benefits to the business. So, the business could either receive cash inflows from that resources or use that economic resources to produce goods or provide services to the customers, which in turn would result to a cash inflow to the entity. So, yan ang ibig sabihin ng assets. So, next is liability. So, what is liability? So, a liability is a present obligations of the entity to transfer an economic resources as a result of past event. So, in simple term, liability is utang. So, kunyari, the company don't have enough funds or they need additional funds for a new project. So, the company then apply for a loan or nangutang si company to have enough funds needed for the operations. So, they can either file a loan to a bank. So, ibig sabihin, liability is an obligations that the company must settle or pay. So, ano yung ilan sa mga example ng liability? First is accounts payable. Kunyari, may in-order si company na supplies na di nila binayaran agad in cash kay supplier. So, kunyari, on account, yung mode of payment, on account. So, yan is accounts payable nila kay supplier. O kaya, the company apply for a loan to a bank. So, that is a loans payable. So, other examples are notes payable and accrued liabilities or yung mga unsettled expenses that is owed to others by the entity. So, take note that for a liability to exist, there are three elements that must be satisfied first. And what are these? First, the entity has present obligations. Second is the obligation is the transfer an economic resources. And third is the obligation exists because of past events. So, ibig sabihin yan, for us to consider an obligation as a liability, the obligation must be present or current obligations. Obligasyon ni company yan ngayon. They have an existing responsibility or duty to settle that they cannot avoid that responsibility. And saan ang galing yung obligations mong yan? Kunyari, nangutang ka ngayon ng pera sa bank. So at present, you now have the duty and responsibility to the bank to settle that debt in the future. So your transactions or loan agreement with the bank is the past events that causes you the obligations or loans payable. And of course, to settle it, you have to pay cash or use your resources to settle the obligations in the future. And the cash settlement, kunyari binayaran mo yung utang mo ng cash, then it results to an outflow of company's resources. May nabawas or nawala kay company after the settlement of these obligations. Or there's an outflow of resources. So yan ang liability. You should satisfy first these three elements for us to consider the transaction as a liability. It is a present obligations, there's an outflow of economic benefits, and it is a result of past events. So what is equity? Equity is the residual interest in the assets of the enterprises after deducting all its liabilities. So if the external creditors like banks have an interest over the company's asset because of the present obligations that happen due to some events, then yung equity, in other words, are the remaining claims against the entity other than those claims from creditors. Yan yung natitirang portions ng assets o resources na hindi magagamit to settle any liability or di nakaalat for external obligations of the company to other parties. So, lagyan natin ng figure. Kunyari, may asset kang 10,000. may pagkakautang ka or liability amounting to 6,000. So, yung residual interest mo or equity ni company ay 4,000 na lang. Kasi yan yung tira or di nagamit pang bayad utang or obligasyon ni company. So, yung 4,000 na lang na yan na natira, yan yung pwede lang i-enjoy ni owner or ni company. So, take note that the presentations of equity in the financial statement depends on the form of the business. So, di ba meron tayong 3 general forms of business organization. Ano nga yun? Sole proprietorship, partnership, and corporation. That is the 3 general form of business organization. So, if the business is a sole proprietorship, so di ba isa lang ang may-ari ng sole proprietorship. So, there will be one owner's equity account lang. If it is a partnership business wherein 2 or more persons are the owners, so there will be 2 or more equity accounts, one for each partners or owners. And in the corporation type of business, equity is called stockholders' equity, which consists of share capital or shares of stocks, retained earnings, yan yung naipong kita ni corporations, and reserves representing appropriations of retained earnings. Yan naman yung portion ng retained earnings na nakaalat na for specific purposes. So now, pag-usapan natin why we have these equations and why we use it in the accounting process. So looking back to the formula, A is equals L plus E, or asset is equals liabilities plus equity. And the expanded accounting equation is asset is equals liabilities plus equity plus income minus expenses. So these equations represent the resources controlled by the entity, which is A. So the assets is the resources controlled by the entity. So the present obligations of the entity is represented by L, or the liabilities. And the residual interest of the entity in the assets is represented by E, which is the equity. So take note that equity does not only covers the capital of the business. Nakikita rin natin or napapaloob sa equity yung total income na naiipon or kinikita ni business. Kaya yung expanded accounting equation natin is asset is equals to liabilities plus equity plus income and expenses. So income less expenses is net loss or net gain or net income. So net gain if mas mataas yung net income as compared to expenses. So there will be net loss if the expenses is higher than the income. So whatever is the net loss or net income earned by the company, it is actually part of the equity. That is why equity includes the income or loss that is incurred by the company over time. Hindi lamang capital ang nire-represent ng equity. So, the formula shows that in a company, their total resources equals the total claims. So, makikita natin that the total resources equals, and these claims comes from claims of creditors and claims of the owners. So, in other words, an assets or resources can either be claims of creditors or claims of the owners. So, paano natin masasabi na ang resources or an asset is either a claim of the owners or claim of the creditors? So, for example, there is a capital investment. So, the owner invested cash to the company or to the business. Because of that capital investment, nagkaroon ng increase in cash. So, nagkaroon ka ngayon ng cash, which is an assets or resources. Pero yan is nanggaling kay owner because that is capital investment of the owner. So that cash is claims of the owner. So for example, the cash invested by the owner is 10,000. So that 10,000 is claims of the owner. Kay owner yan. So paano naman natin masasabing it is a claim of creditors. So, a resources is claims of creditors. So, for example, si company, walang enough na resources. So, they filed a loan to a bank or to an external creditor. Ngayon, na-approve yung loan. So, nakatanggap ngayon si company ng cash because of that loan applications to a bank. So, there's an increase in cash which is an assets or a resources. And merong full control si company. That is why it is considered as cash. But because of that loan agreement to the bank, nagkaroon ng liability or pagkakautang si company kay bank. Kaya siya naging claims of the creditors. So, yung formula na A is equals L plus E, so pinapakita niyan that the total resources or asset is equals to liabilities and equity. Resources can either be claims of the owners or claims of the investor. So the equation is usually presented as A is equals L plus E. The assets are on the left side of the equations, opposite the liabilities and equity. So if there's a recorded increases or decreases in the asset, that should be recorded also in the liabilities or equity account. So kunyari, the transaction is the company applied for a cash loan in a bank. The effect of that transactions would be increase in asset dahil naka-receive si company ng cash sa bank. Kaso, dahil sa fast event na yan, nagkaroon naman si company ng present obligation kay bank na kailangan niyang isettle in the future. So, anong effect niyang transaction na yan sa liabilities or equity? So, there will be an increase in liability. Kasi yung fast event is yung loan agreement with the bank. And dahil nga sa loan agreement with the bank, nagkaroon ng liability ngayon si entity dahil may utang na siya kay bangko. So going back to the equation, usually, gaya ng sabi ko, it is presented as A is equals L plus E. But we can derive these equations into other forms, like L is equals A minus E, or E is equals A minus E. So yan yung accounting equations. And we can use these accounting equations in computing the total assets, the total liabilities, or equity of a certain entity using these equations or derived equations. So let's apply the accounting equations in certain cases. So first, question is, if total asset is 20,000 and total liabilities is 6,000, how much is the total equity? So remember that the formula is A is equals L plus E. Asset is equals liabilities plus equity. So for us to compute the total equity, we can deduct the total liabilities to the total assets. So 20,000 less 6,000, so the total equity is 14,000. So number 2, if total liabilities is 4,000 and the total equity is 4,500, how much is the total assets? So going back with the formula, asset is equals liabilities plus equity. So for us to compute how much is the total asset, we can add the total liabilities and total equity. So 4,000 plus 4,500, so makukompute natin yung total asset, which is 8,500. So number 3 questions. So if the total asset is 15,000 and the total equity is 5,000, how much is the total liabilities? So we can use the formula or the accounting equations in order for us to compute the total liabilities. And for us to get the total liabilities, i-deduct natin or i-minus natin yung total equity sa total asset. Dahil nga, remember, asset is equals to liability plus equity. So if total asset is 15,000, then the total liabilities in number 3 questions is 10,000. So 10,000 plus 5,000, so total equity and total liabilities is 15,000, which is equal to total asset amounting to 15,000. So the answer number 3 is 10,000. So the total liabilities is 10,000. Next, number 4 questions. If the total income is 20,000 and the total expenses are 10,000, how much is the profit or loss? So, remember the expanded accounting equations na nakalagay doon, income less expenses is net loss or net income. So based on this problem, the total income daw is 20,000 and the total expenses is 10,000. So 20,000 less total expenses of 10,000, makukompute natin yung profit or loss. And since mas mataas yung total income as compared sa total expenses, kaya ang sagot dito sa number 4 is 10,000 profit. And the last question is, if total income is 15,000, total expenses are 10,000, total liabilities is 7,000, and total equity before profit or loss is 6,000, how much is the total assets? So remember the formula or the expanded accounting equations na asset is equals liabilities plus equity plus income less expenses. And since the given total equity here is before profit or loss, ibig sabihin, hindi pa dyan kasama yung total income or net income. So, for us to get the net income or net loss, we should deduct the total expenses over the total income. So, total income is 15,000 less total expenses of 10,000. So, the total net income of the company is 5,000. And we should add it to the total equity na 6,000. So, 5,000 plus 6,000 is 11,000. And given naman na yung total liabilities is 7,000. So, 11,000 plus 7,000 na liabilities, then makukuha na natin or makukompute na natin yung total asset. And that is 18,000 pesos. So, that is sample problems in the applications of accounting equations. So, through the use of accounting equations, we can compute the total asset, the total liabilities, or equity using the accounting equation. So, I hope that you understand what is accounting equation on this topic.